This is Mrs. Miller, your teacher at ELA Academy. Today, we'll talk about the different types of clauses. If you haven't watched the video about the parts of a clause yet, I recommend doing that first. To review briefly, however, a clause contains a subject and a main verb, and it sounds like a complete sentence if you read it without any conjunctions at the beginning. We'll look at three types of clauses today: independent, dependent, and relative. The first type we'll look at is the independent clause. An independent clause will either have no conjunction at the beginning or it will have a FANBOYS conjunction. You should remember FANBOYS from the conjunctions video: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. We'll see these on the next slide. Let's look at an independent clause. You saw this sentence in the last video: Santa delivers presents. It's a clause because it has a subject and a verb. We don't have a FANBOYS conjunction at the beginning either. Generally, you don't want to begin a sentence with one of those because it technically breaks a grammar rule. You will see people doing it from time to time, even in professional writing, but don't do it in your English class. What about this one? With the help of his elves and reindeer, Santa delivers presents to eager children on Christmas Eve. We still have the same basic subject-verb-object, Santa delivers presents, but what about the rest of this stuff? Do you see any other subjects and verbs, or perhaps a conjunction? No. Actually, what we have are several prepositional phrases. You'll see me mention prepositional phrases pretty frequently when we talk about grammar and sentence structure because people who don't recognize them will sometimes mix them up with other things. Like, they might think help is the verb and elves and reindeer are the compound subject. They can also create confusion with subject-verb agreement, which we'll talk about in another video. So if you haven't watched the prepositions video yet, be sure to do that. Now, like I said, you generally don't want to put a FANBOYS conjunction at the beginning of a sentence. This is what it'll look like if you're being grammatically correct. Santa delivers toys, and the children open them eagerly. Notice that we have two independent clauses joined together to make a sentence. The first independent clause has the subject Santa and the verb delivers. Again, they're color-coded to make them easier to see. The second independent clause has the subject children and the verb open. Notice that we've joined the clauses with a comma plus a FANBOYS conjunction. Two more examples. It takes all year to make toys, but Santa delivers them all in one night. And you were good this year, so Santa will bring you presents. For each example, we have two independent clauses joined by a comma plus a FANBOYS conjunction. Therefore, the second independent clause in each case begins with a FANBOYS conjunction. Remember, it's generally considered a no-no to begin a sentence with one of those, so try to keep them between clauses. There are other ways to join independent clauses correctly, but we'll look at those in the next video, sentence types. But now we're ready to look at another type of clause, the dependent or subordinate clause. This type will always begin with a subordinating conjunction, sometimes called a dependent word. If you recall from the conjunctions video, we can remember the most common subordinating conjunctions with the acronym AWOBIS: as, after, although, when, while, until, before, because, if, since. You'll really find it helpful to memorize these and the FANBOYS. It'll make it so much easier to recognize dependent and independent clauses. Just repeat them about 10 times a day until you have them down pat. For and nor, but or yet so. For and nor, but or yet so. As, after, although, when, while, until, before, because, if, since. As, after, although, when, while, until, before, because, if, since. Now, a dependent clause is called dependent because it cannot stand on its own. It must be connected to an independent clause. Again, yes, you will see people breaking this rule even in professional writing. But if you're in need of watching videos like this one, that's a hint that you aren't yet ready to break the rules yourself. Since dependent clauses must be paired with independent clauses, that's what we'll look at for our examples. First, leave cookies for Santa before you go to bed. Where's the subject for the first clause? You might remember this from the last video, parts of the clause. Imperative or command sentences have an implied you for the subject. From the color coding, you can see that we have two clauses, you leave and you go. The first one has no conjunction at the beginning, so it's an independent clause. The second begins with a conjunction before. What kind of conjunction is that? It's an awubis word, so it's a subordinating conjunction. That makes the second clause dependent. Let's look at another example. Santa delivers presents while children are sleeping. The first clause has no conjunction, so again, it's independent. While is an awubis conjunction, so this one is dependent. Notice that these two examples both follow the same pattern, independent plus dependent clause. When they appear in this order, you don't need to do anything special to join them, no extra punctuation or anything. But if you reverse the order, you do need a little something. This is the exact same sentence, except that the dependent clause comes first. That means we need a comma between the clauses. It may seem weird to use a comma with one pattern and not the reverse, but hey, you'll be holding your breath for a long time if you expect the English language to always make sense. That brings us to the relative clause. The relative clause is an awful lot like a dependent clause. It can't stand on its own and must be attached to an independent clause. It also begins with something similar to a subordinating conjunction, a relative pronoun or a relative adverb. You know what pronouns are. They stand for nouns. So a relative pronoun is one that you could replace with a noun, like that, who, or which. Relative adverbs deal with place and time, like when and where. Now here's where we see some major differences between the dependent and the relative clause. A relative pronoun can act as the subject of the clause. Also, sometimes when the word that is used as a relative pronoun, we leave it out. That can make it sort of challenging to identify a relative clause. And this is the one that can really mess with your head. A relative clause can appear in the middle of another clause. What? Yep, we'll see what that looks like. First example. I know that Santa will bring me presents. This should be pretty easy to see by now, at least with the color coding. Independent clause here, and then relative clause here, beginning with the relative pronoun that. But remember how the word that can be left out? That's why I put square brackets around it. Let's read the sentence again without the relative pronoun. I know Santa will bring me presents. Sounds okay, doesn't it? We leave that word out all the time. What about this one? I hope that you will like the present that I got you. Independent clause, relative clause, another relative clause. But again, we could leave out the relative pronoun that. I hope you will like the present I got you. Yes, I know, this is a recipe for a big headache, but it is grammatically correct. At least now that you know it's an issue, you can be on the lookout for it. What about this? The children who spent all day decorating the house for Christmas will sleep soundly tonight. Notice the relative pronoun who? Remember that we said the relative pronoun can act like the subject of the clause. That's the case here. It's a relative pronoun still. It still acts sort of like a conjunction, but at the same time, it's the subject. Who spent? That's why I underlined it in blue, because we always put our subjects in blue. This is also one of those sentences where the relative clause is plopped down in the middle of another clause. The independent clause is, the children will sleep soundly tonight. The relative clause gives us more information about the children and why they'll be sleeping so well. They got all tired out putting up garland and lights and ornaments. I hope this video has helped you feel more comfortable with the three main types of clauses. If you haven't watched the other videos in this series yet, I really recommend that you do, because in grammar, all the parts work together, and you can't really understand something like clauses without understanding nouns, verbs, and conjunctions at the very least. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest so that you can be notified when I post new content. And if you find these instructional videos helpful, please consider supporting ELA Academy on Patreon. This is ELA Academy.